Good morning, everybody. Let's call the meeting to order. Roll call. Let the records show that all members are here except for Mr. Kilborn. Changes to the agenda. Are there any changes, staff?
There are no changes to the agenda.
Thank you, Joshua. Takes us to item 4, public comment. This is for any member of the public to address the Water Commission on items of Water Commission interest not on today's agenda. I don't have any slips. Has anyone wished to speak under public comment? Great. Not hearing any. Takes us to consent calendar. That is item 5, the meeting minutes, the approval of the minutes of October 19th, 2017. Any questions or comments on that item?
Was this the meeting that Mr. Americano gave the presentation at? Was that in October?
October, yes.
There's nothing, I didn't see anything in the minutes regarding that. So if you want, if we could add a paragraph that, or a sentence at least that addresses that, people who would come back and look at the minutes would know that they could check the record for that presentation, which I was absent at that meeting, and I watched the video. That's a really interesting presentation.
Yes, it does make mention here, introduce Steve Americano, legal counsel for CCWA.
Okay,
It was under.
got it.
Okay, sorry. I think
No, that's
I
okay.
was
That was
both
my
looking
fault.
under the wrong one.
Okay. On that particular item, do I have a motion?
I'll move. I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? I abstain. I was not at that particular meeting. Takes us to item 6, administrative items. Item A, the Stage 3 drought update and annual water supply management report.
Good morning, Chair, Commissioners, Councilmember White. My name's Kelly Dyer. I'll be giving the drought update and annual water supply management report this morning. So I'll walk through the drought status, the demand status, our water supply strategy, our water supply status of each of our sources, and we'll discuss the 2017 annual water supply management report. Rainfall totals for the current water year, which began, this is September 1st, which is the county's water year, 1 month different than ours, which starts October 1st. Gibraltar's at 0.32 inches, Kachuma's at 0.52, and Santa Barbara's at 0.44. This is well below normal rainfall. We really have not had any rain. It's been extremely dry.
To put that in perspective, Gibraltar should have about 5.5 inches at this point.
So the drought is far from over, and as you can see, we remain in the shaded area of where drought conditions still exist within the state. And I always highlight the footnote, which is that it's based on broad-scale conditions, and local conditions may vary. Even within Santa Barbara County, some agencies in the North County are not necessarily in a drought condition because of their water supply mix, versus the South County, which relies heavily on Kachuma, is still in emergency drought conditions. This is our 3-month look ahead from the National Weather Service, and so we're seeing that the projections are below normal rainfall for the next 3 months. So it's consistent with our supply planning, which assumes continued drought conditions. This is our demand status, which tracks our monthly demands. We had a 34% reduction in demands for the month of November compared with our 2013 pre-drought demands. And our 12-month running average is 40%, so we continue to exceed our conservation targets of 30%, which is great. As we've had this conservation, we've been also monitoring our water revenues, which are dependent on water sales. We receive 70% or more of our revenue from volumetric usage. So what we've been seeing is that our revenues are still tracking fairly consistently with our projected revenues. They're actually a little bit better so far, slightly, but you know, the summer months is when we really have our higher revenue when the irrigation demands are higher. And then in the winter months, we typically see a decline in revenues. We have had our meter replacement program that's still ongoing, and so that continues to reduce the system losses, which is helping our revenues as well. And we've also seen a little bit more Tier 2 and Tier 3 water usage compared with what we originally predicted in the model. But it's still early in the year. We have several months to go before we see what the end of year results are. This chart shows our total water production going back to the 1980s. And so this was the total water use before the last drought. And then you see the significant decline in demands when the drought emergency was declared. And after the drought ended, our demands slowly recovered, but they never returned to what they were before the drought. And here we are in the current drought, where our demands are now below what they were in the previous drought, which is pretty remarkable given that we've had an increase in population and tourism. And we also have not had to take as draconian measures of on the restrictions on water use and development. So this is our current water supply strategy, and we are now in the 7th year of drought. The previous years represent our actual water usage. And then we do project out an additional 2 years. We're always planning for at least 3 years of water supply. So starting from the bottom, the purple is our recycled water. The dark blue is Kachuma allocations. The light blue is Gibraltar. Yellow is groundwater. So you can see we're resting our groundwater basins this year. We have orange is the state water project, and green is desalination. These projections are based on a 30% conservation target through 2020. As you can see, we do see a shortage occurring in future years, and so after we see what the winter brings with rainfall, we'll be reassessing our conservation targets this spring in order to address that gap in 2020. Gibraltar Reservoir is currently at about 1,600 acre-feet of storage. That's 32% of capacity. It did spill this year, and it stopped spilling in early May. Since then, we've been maximizing our diversions. We have a hydroelectric plant, which creates renewable energy, so we've been able to utilize that this year. And our water quality has remained good, so we continue to prioritize our use of Gibraltar. Kachuma is at 39% of capacity. I think that looks like a typo, since the total storage should be more than 7,000 if it's 39%. 70,000, it would be closer. So we have received our 40% allocation for water year 2018. Downstream water rights releases occurred this year. Over 10,000 acre-feet of water was released over the summer, and that ended in late October. And our fish releases have resumed. Those are about 100 to 150 acre-feet per month. And then we've had a couple of fires this year, which we expect will affect water quality in Kachuma, both the Whittier fire and now the Thomas fire, which is affecting other reservoirs as well. So this is just a summary of the Thomas fire. We've had 172,000 acres burn. It's on track to be the largest wildfire in California. It's 60% contained. It did burn all of the watershed for Jameson Reservoir. This is Jameson right here. And it also burned a portion of the Gibraltar watershed. So we are anticipating water quality impacts from a combination of all the fires that have occurred over the years. We have the Thomas fire, the Whittier fire, the Ray fire, And then prior to that, we had the Zaka fire. And so we have impacts to all of our surface water supplies, as well as the habitat for some of the endangered species that steelhead trout that reside in the watershed. So in terms of water quality, turbidity and organic material are the main challenges with all the sediment and ash that runs into the reservoir. The city has had experience with previous fires, with the Zaka fire, which was a huge fire in the Gibraltar watershed. We've over the years made a lot of improvements to our treatment system. So we've added ozone pretreatment, activated carbon system. We have enhanced filter backwash capabilities, so now we can do continuous backwashing at the plant. And we also have added pretreatment at Laurel Reservoir. And so we feel well prepared to be able to address challenging water quality coming into Cater Water Treatment Plant. It will be a challenge for our staff, and it will be expensive, but we think we can get through this period and still meet or exceed our drinking water regulations. We are collaborating with other neighboring water agencies. As we know, Cater also serves Montecito and Carpinteria. And our adaptive management strategy is to keep Laurel Reservoir full, which would provide operational flexibility. That can meet about several weeks of demand in the winter without any deliveries from Kachuma. And we'd also be relying on our other water supplies during this time. So our groundwater wells are currently resting, but if we need them because of water quality reasons, we would bring them back online.
You can tell me you're going to talk about this later, but questions around the fire retardants and the impact on the watersheds.
Sure. So Phos-Chek is used for fighting fires, and it's essentially a fertilizer type substance and can increase phosphate in our water supplies. We did, in the Zaka fire, increase our monitoring of phosphate, so we have a lot of really good data to see what happened and what we could expect this time. We did see an increase in phosphates in our raw water, a slight increase after the Zaka fire, but we were able to remove it in treatment. So that was a good result, I think. And we haven't seen any algal blooms. That sometimes can sometimes happen when there's an increase in phosphates. We have not seen that at Gibraltar. So I know in 2011 an environmental impact study was done on Phos-Chek. As a result of that study, the Forest Service limits and has set parameters on where they use it. It has to be at least 300 feet from a water body if it's by aircraft, I believe, and 100 feet if it's by truck. So at this point, we haven't really seen any issues based on previous fires, but we will be increasing our monitoring as a result of the Thomas fire just to keep an eye on it. Our imported water supplies, the city has 2,000 acre-feet stored at Kachuma and about 1,400 acre-feet stored at San Luis. We did receive an initial allocation from DWR for this calendar year, which was 15%. It's pretty dry up north this year, too, so I don't know. Usually this allocation would increase throughout the year, but we haven't heard anything about any increases at this point. Water debt, we returned 2,900 acre-feet of water to AVEC this year, and we have approximately 3,300 acre-feet of remaining water debt, which can be paid off over approximately 10-year period or so. So we continue to maximize our delivery of state water to Kachuma. Our current pipe capacity is about 280 acre-feet per month. All the South Coast agencies have been sending all the state water that they can, keeping the pipe full. But we did have a shutdown in November. This is something that DWR does every year for annual maintenance. And so it was shut down for about 3 weeks in November. Groundwater basins are currently resting. We have about 30% of the remaining yield in storage of our groundwater basins. That's based on USGS groundwater modeling studies. We do monitor our groundwater levels at a number of locations, and they are still low. They're near where they were after the last drought. And we expect that the full recovery would take about 5 to 10 years. The wells do continue to be exercised regularly in case they need to be brought back online for water quality reasons. Desalination project, the acceptance testing has been completed. We're working with IDE, the contractor, to develop a public tour, and still awaiting our award announcement for Prop 1 funds. That was a $10 million grant that we applied for, and that's been pushed back. It's mid-December has passed, and we still haven't heard anything. So
you want to explain the acceptance testing has been completed? That means we're signed off?
Mr. Chair,
That's why I asked.
there are several layers to it, but the acceptance testing is where they had to demonstrate that they have run the treatment plant and shown that it can produce water, and they have to run for a certain period of time. Now there's still remaining some punch list items to actually close out the contract, and so there's still some items going on. As you can see in those units right there, the actual treatment units are actually supposed to be covered, and it's kind of a sound attenuation and also protection of the equipment, and so that's something they haven't finished yet. So there are.
But in terms of production wise,
yes, they were down last week when we were out of power, but for the most part, yes.
great, thank you.
All right, and so now on to our water year 2017 water supply management report. This is a report that we do every year. It summarizes.
I have a question briefly about the groundwater. You said we're watching the USGS monitoring wells. Presumably, we don't get any recharge until we actually get some rain and water running down mainly Mission Creek for the downtown basin. In the past, we have diverted water down Mission Creek, which was basically tunnel inflow water or perhaps even real Gibraltar water. Are there any plans to do that to increase recharge now?
Commissioner Keller, there are no plans at this time. That practice has stopped. I think there were concerns over bringing non-native water into this side of the mountains on this side of the watershed for steelhead trout concerns. But we do have injection capability at a number of our groundwater wells. And so as soon as we do get some rain and start seeing Kachuma spilling, we do plan to do a pilot study to inject some of our treated surface water into the groundwater to enhance some of that recharge.
Thank you.
Kelly, you don't have to go back, but then just go from back to front. But that California drought picture, really the only thing that's keeping that from still screaming exceptional is the seasonal low usage, right? The relationship between what we have and the usage, because the public message would still be we're in an exceptional drought, right?
Correct. For our area, we're in an exceptional emergency drought condition still.
So just want to get that out there. Right. And then on the desal supply bar chart for the next 2 years, what percentage of capacity production does that represent?
It's the full production capacity.
Oh. And so then when you start to look at that constraint versus water supply, and you start to look at the need in a couple years for additional conservation, and you start to look at maybe this year even having, or in the next year, having to conserve and the way it plays on rates, when do we start, you're probably already doing this, but when do we start to have that big conversation about what that looks like? So we're going to be asked to save more water. That's going to run rates down. Rates are going to have to increase. We might need a greater production base at desal to cover that. When does that big picture discussion start here?
Usually we've been doing those discussions in the springtime after we see what the rainfall, what the winter brings. A spring is a good time to reassess our water supply and our water rates, and address both of them at that time.
Okay. I think, because that's a constant question I hear out there, that like if you know you're in exceptional drought, why are you waiting so long? So I think that should be part of our message too. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Bendy?
Thank you. How long is it to get the next train of desal? Talk briefly about the next chunk of desal, the timing on that, and how that relates to obviously to our supply.
Councilmember White, Commissioners, when we were looking at this last year, it was approximately 12 months to get the additional treatment trains. So the additional expansion of the treatment plant was approximately 12 months. But as you may recall, the conveyance of that water is what becomes our next hurdle. And the construction is anticipated to take about 24 months to construct the conveyance that would be necessary to handle that water. And so as we get closer to spring, we will be talking about, if we need to go that route, we could be talking about funding sources and how we would fund that, and potentially getting that going under a design build kind of a format in which they're kind of doing the design as they're constructing it. But so I would say at least a 2-year period to really take advantage of the next increment of capacity in the desal plant.
And could I follow the question there? You talked about the grant funds, which we're still waiting to hear on the desal plant. Is there any thought, essentially, because of that question of the next follow-up, holding on to those funds rather than allocating them until we know?
I think the timing will probably work out that way, just based on the slow nature of DWR. Even if they were to come out, and I'm hearing rumors that it might give us word tomorrow. But if they were to come out tomorrow, there's still paperwork that has to be signed. There's a bunch of requirements for it, and so it likely wouldn't be money we would actually see until probably the spring, which would be the time we'd be talking about what to do.
I think
with
you
that.
mentioned at some point we were going to have a discussion about the options in that regard. Do you see that coming up in the next couple of meetings?
I was planning to bring back just here are some of the short list of what we're thinking about, and get the Commission's input on what we should be developing in more detail and bringing back for further discussion. And so on the list will be that transmission main, as we talked about AMI and a couple other things that we potentially could utilize those funds for.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Chair, what's
Ben.
the cost of that conveyance piece?
It's somewhere around the $10 million range. I think that's where we left off.
Okay, so back to our 2017 Water Supply Management Report. This is an annual report. We do it every year. We summarize our water supplies from the previous year, so it is a backwards-looking document. It's part of our EIR requirements for the State Water Project, and we are required to make findings that our groundwater basins are in long-term balance. So we talk about the diverse water supply mix, which is Lake Cachuma, Gibraltar Reservoir and Mission Tunnel, state water and supplemental water purchases, groundwater, desalination, recycled water, and our water conservation program. And this chart shows on the left-hand side was our planned water supply for the year at the beginning of the year versus what actually was supplied. And you can see with the red, that was our extraordinary water conservation. So we did exceed our targets on conservation. The blue, the darker blue, is Cachuma. We did receive a Cachuma allocation this year, but we're not planning to use it. We're going to carry it over to next year. And the orange, light blue is Gibraltar. So we were fortunate that Gibraltar filled and spilled this year which allowed us to reduce the use of our state water and groundwater. And then the green is our desalination, which had some challenges at startup, which have since been fixed. So regarding our groundwater supplies, it is one of our truly local water resources in that it's on this side of the mountains, and so is desalination. That's important in case there was ever a seismic event or an emergency in which the supply from our tunnels was shut down. And our strategy for managing the groundwater basin is to base load it using the safe yield in normal years, and then in times of drought and emergency, we increase our groundwater pumping. So we really, it's what's called in lieu management of the groundwater basins, where we are conjunctively managing them with our other supplies. So we reduce the pumping and let the basins recover when we have other supplies available.
Mr. Chairman, do we have, I can't remember the last time we looked at the actual data from the wells, but in each basin, is there a single well that we can call the token indicator well for that basin and monitor where it is in terms of the capacity?
Commissioner Keller, we monitor about 60 wells. We have selected a handful of them and have included those in the Water Resources Managers reports every month that are distributed. So we have tried to narrow it down to a few wells, but we do look at all 60 wells for the basin. So this is a map of our groundwater basins. And up here is the Foothill Basin. The city has 3 wells in the Foothill Basin, and that basin is also shared by other pumpers. La Cumbre Mutual Water Company has wells in the Foothill Basin, as well as some private pumpers. Storage Unit 1, also known as the Downtown Basin, the city has 6 wells. One of them is in need of repair, but the others are all functional. And the city is the only known pumper in Storage Unit 1, and the water from Storage Unit 1 for most of those wells goes to the Ortega groundwater treatment plant. It does require some treatment. Alameda well is the only one that's not currently connected to the groundwater treatment plant, but we are seeing a need to do that in the future. So we have been working on the design of a conveyance pipeline to connect Alameda to Ortega. Storage Unit 3, the city has 1 well there, which serves our non-potable recycled water system. We really don't use it all that much. It's only when the recycled plant is down for maintenance, we might turn that well on to supplement the system.
Chair, what is the state of that basin as far as how much capacity is left in there? I know we pumped it for a year and a half kind of thing. How is that doing?
Storage Unit 3, we stayed within the estimated safe yield, so the water levels are okay. We haven't gone into overdraft in that basin, and we haven't been pumping it for quite some time because the recycled water plant has been online for over a year now. It's a very small basin compared to the other 2. Foothill and Storage Unit 1 have more capacity, or they're larger basins, and they're also the ones that are used for potable water. Foothill Basin, as I mentioned, there's several other pumpers. We do have a modeling study that we jointly did with the United States Geological Survey. We have a detailed numerical groundwater model to estimate the yield, and during drought periods, that's estimated to be a total of 5,600 acre-feet for the city. Our production in water year 2017 was 382. We have an estimated remaining yield of 1,300 acre feet in that basin. As mentioned earlier, the water levels are pretty low. They're near where they were in the last drought. I did want to mention for Foothill Basin too, sometimes water levels are really the issue there. We don't see seawater intrusion getting up to the Foothill Basin because it's so far inland. And when you draw the water levels down, in some basins, compaction is an issue and you can have a long-term loss of storage. We've never seen that happen in the Foothill Basin. Really haven't seen any land subsidence or anything of that sort in our basins. Storage Unit 1 had a multi-year drought yield of estimated to be 7,000 to 13,000 acre feet. The city's production last year was 956, and based on the lower end of that drought yield, we have an estimated remaining yield of 2,400 in that basin. And we do continue to monitor for seawater intrusion. We brought the Alameda and High School wells online during this drought, which shifted the pumping farther inland to help mitigate against seawater intrusion. So I think we're in good shape there. But if we do start to see seawater coming in, it does take a very long time to recover from that. It took about 20 years after the last drought to push the seawater back out to the ocean. So Storage Unit 3 has challenging water quality. There are other pumpers in the basin. The safe yield to the city is about 100 acre feet, and we only used about 12 acre feet last year. Really don't see a need to use it unless our recycled water plant is down.
Is there more than just the Valverde well there?
The city only has one well, the Valle Verde well. But there are other wells by private pumpers.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, and so that brings us to the recommendation that council approve and adopt the City of Santa Barbara Water Supply Management Report for the 2017 water year, finding that groundwater resources are in long-term balance and in accordance with the conjunctive management element of the city's long-term water supply plan. We did include a copy of the draft report in the Water Commission packet. It will be posted. I wanted to get your input today of any comments from the Water Commission on that report, and then we plan to post it for public review for about 30 days, and then it's scheduled to go to council in January. I think it's January 23rd is the council date.
Very good. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's to the commission. Is there any comments people want to make before I ask for public comment?
As a hydrogeologist, to me, the concept of long-term balance of a groundwater basin is sort of illusory, and it depends on rain to fill it back up. And so to say that it's in long-term balance, you're assuming that it is going to rain, which of course we don't know. And I'm comfortable stating that that's the case to keep the state happy, but it may be sort of a deceptive thing to say or self-deceptive. Thank you.
What? Any other comments?
Question.
Go ahead. Cindy.
And maybe this is to Barry as much as anything, there's some flow that happens out of the mountains into the ground, into the basins.
It's true.
Even if it doesn't, it's got a lag and an indirect connection there somehow. So maybe you could talk about that for a second.
Right.
Barry?
There is some water storage up higher at higher elevation in the mountains, as we see from the fact that we keep getting inflow into the tunnel. And however, quantitatively, how fast that water moves down into the lower basins, I don't think it's ever been accurately modeled or measured, but some of it does occur, certainly. So we will get some recharge no matter what, even if it doesn't rain.
Would it be related to, we see the tunnels production go up and down in lag to drought, right? And is there a relationship there with the groundwater wells?
So the higher elevations up in the mountains definitely get recharged by rain that falls at higher elevations. So if we don't get rain up there, ultimately that source will cease to work also.
So Commission may recall we did have UCSB going through Mission Tunnel with us for quite so many years, taking a look at particularly the stalactite growth in there, but then also the age of the water. And if I recall right, it was somewhere around 25 years old, the water that was making it down into the tunnel. So there is a considerable lag, and the way they kind of described it is these, basically these little pools, or basically as water comes in, it pushes water back into the tunnel. And so the longer these droughts go on, the longer it kind of takes for that cycle to trickle down into the tunnel again. Mm-hmm.
Megan?
When we talk about potable reuse, and specifically indirect potable reuse, I know we said that our groundwater basins aren't big enough to give us the lag time required. But what is that lag time? How long, if we were to put treated wastewater into our groundwater, would we need to let it sit before we could use it according to state law?
I think it depends on the level of treatment. On the recycled water side, it can be as little as 2 months, I think, is the. But they might even, if you can demonstrate that you have enough, you might be able to do a pilot test to show a smaller lag time. But 2 to 6 months, I think, is generally what the general rule is. And we did find that some level of indirect reuse might be feasible, but there were a lot of potential issues with mounding. And it also was going to require several additional wells to inject the water. And that once you start poking that many holes in the basin, it can be a conduit for contaminants. And it was very expensive to add that many wells and also upgrade the Ortega groundwater treatment plant.
Other questions? Kelly, on page 3, you say the planned 6-year water supply strategy was considered the design drought for planning purposes. What was the design drought for Cachuma in terms of its safe yield? Was it 6 or 7 or less?
Well, that's a good question. I think that I haven't seen any record of anything more than 5 years. So
That's why I asked the question. That kind of stuck in my mind, too.
yeah.
Okay. And then the only other question I had is, in all of the rainfall history things, we always look at this average. Is anybody looking at to see whether the average by decade is changing, or if the average basically been pretty constant over the recorded period?
We can look into that. We've really
I'm curious. I mean, it wasn't something for this report, but again, just given the change in climate that we're looking at, are we seeing any change in the averages over time?
we're looking at, I think right now it's a 50-year average, and we do roll it each year, year by year, but it would be interesting to look at decade by decade.
And that was just an observation. Are you looking for any action from us today?
To recommend that the water supply
the
management
recommendation.
report be adopted.
Okay, does anyone from the public want to speak on this item? Arturo? You want to come up to the mic because we're on TV. Sorry.
Thank you for a very nice report. So I was going to ask, in terms of groundwater recharge, are we using any recycled water for that at this point?
We're not currently using recycled water for groundwater recharge. We did do a potable reuse feasibility study very recently, and the results of that study found that direct reuse would be a more viable option for us once the state has regulations that would allow it.
I was just thinking because of the banking capability that you have there. And then the other question would be, in terms of, I can see the issue of injection, that has impacts in terms of mounting, but if you have recharge basins, do we have any opportunities for recharge basins in the area at all?
I wish we did. There's not a lot of areas for spreading grounds. We just don't have the land available. And also the characteristics of our groundwater basins are that we have a consolidating layer. So
But we don't have a lot of
what is
Conductivity, yeah.
put on the exactly. There's not a lot of conductivity between the shallow zone and our deeper water producing zones.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, one of the things I did want to mention, kind of along the lines of what you were bringing up, which is, this trend in obviously receiving less rainfall, but there's also a good discussion going on at the academic level about, well, that's one factor, but then you have to add into there the increased temperatures as well. And so to get the same bang for your buck out of rainfall, given the increased temperatures, you actually should be receiving more rainfall because you're getting more evaporation. And so it's a compounding issue that I think, we need to kind of look at how these together, increased temperatures and decreased rainfall, kind of are going to play out as far as long-term water supply planning.
Okay. Jordan.
So I'll move recommendation of the stack recommendation to council.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any questions, comments? All those in favor say aye.
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 And any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really informative in a lot of ways.
Thank you.
And staying right with it, item 6B, CCWA, CCRB, and COMB update.
Okay, I'll be giving the update as well on this item. So as for COMB, the December meeting was canceled. The COMB office is actually in the mandatory evacuation area, so they're not able to go to their offices right now, and the employees have been working from home. And the next board meeting will be on January 22nd at 2 p.m. I can tell you some of the activities that COMB's been working on. The COMB staff have actively been working with Reclamation to try and figure out what the charges were. You may recall we mentioned that Reclamation went over budget for several years, and it was in the millions. It was $1 million in FY15 and 16. They hadn't identified the deficit for 2017, but they did expect another deficit for 2018 of another 1.2 million. So COMB was looking for an explanation of the charges, and also wanted to see if there was, if we found them justified, then coming up with a payment plan over a number of years. And Reclamation has agreed to have a meeting in January to go over what the charges were for and also discuss a payment plan. So we're hopeful that will mitigate some of the impacts to our budget and our rates. They're also looking at Lake Cachuma and recognizing it's another dry year so far, extremely dry, and gathering information from all the member units, Cachuma member units, on what their planned use of Cachuma water is to try and project out when we might need the barge again. And if it doesn't rain this year, we're going to have to make a decision about reinstalling the barge within this year. The last projections were sometime in the fall of 2018. We'd have to make a decision, and then the barge would be needed by summer of 2019.
At some point, we were talking about making that barge permanent. Is that still in discussion?
I think the COMB is still working with the contractor on different options of potentially sinking at least a portion of the pipe or the whole pipe. So they will be looking at options for doing that.
Mr. Wright.
I'm recalling that when the barge was decommissioned before, that a fair amount of the material and machinery, et cetera, was sort of kept nearby. Isn't there? I think that there's some sort of standby agreement available for just this period of time, so that it's not starting all over again, but they're able to reconstitute just in readiness for what we fear we're experiencing now.
That's correct. The key components were kept on lease and when it was dismantled, so it can be easily put back together again if we if we need to. As for CCRB, we have our next board meeting on January 4th, and I don't have any news to report on the state water rights order or the biological opinion, but I can say that CCRB is in the process of recruiting and hiring a general manager, so we look forward to that process being completed.
Great.
Hit on that, Mr. Chair. They're actually the interviews are scheduled, and I think the expectation and hope is to actually pick someone in the first week of January.
Oh, wow, great.
And for CCWA, we had the last board meeting was on October 25th. At that meeting, the board discussed the state water contract reassignment, and that was approved to move forward. And so now they'll have to continue with discussions with the state and the county on that. But all of the member agencies of CCWA unanimously supported the contract reassignment. The November and December board meetings were canceled, so the next board meeting will be on January 25th. And then as for Cal Water Fix, a brief note on that. At the October meeting, at that time, about 12 agencies or so were supporting the project with varying degrees of participation. They did have some very large water agencies, state water contractors that were supportive of the project. However, some of them only wanted to participate up to about half of what their contract amount was. So, and then there were no federal agencies or ag agencies that were supportive. So, what CCWA staff were saying is that some agencies might want to participate, some may not want to participate, and others may want to participate more than what their contract amount is. And so the state is now considering a downsized project based on the desired capacity of the supporters. And if they do that, then they will most likely, we will most likely be able to tailor our participation based on what is desired. So there might be an opt-in versus an opt-out option. And but at this point, it's all up in the air. And CCWA said that they won't be discussing the matter until some of this gels. And they don't want to spend a lot of energy on it until we have more information on what might be happening with this downsized project.
Well, great. Thank you for the report.
Mr. Chair, so I'd just like to add that we had talked before about having some more direct commission participation and eyes on these areas, and in particularly COMB. And I volunteered for that, and then immediately was out of town in October and November. But Kelly and I, much to her chagrin, we have our date in January to start, and I'm pretty calendared for the rest of the year, so God help us, those eyes will be mine. But you can expect to see a little more participation and report back from somebody else also in regard to COMB.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for doing that. That will help. Thanks again for the report. Is that it for that section? Is that it? Anything else? Okay. Great. That takes us to item 6C. This is Santa Barbara County Water History. Mr. Stubbs, we have County Flood Control and Engineering Manager. Jim, good to see you again. Good morning. Good morning.
Happy winter.
Exactly.
Right. Let's see. Did my PowerPoint come through okay?
It did. If you want to, Jim, if you want to just sit right here, we'll get you. We'll get you a mouse and a keyboard and your.
We have the keyboard. Give me a moment to get set up here. I don't know if a laser pointer will do any good on that, but I have one.
I think it does. I think it works.
Well, anyway, good morning. I am Jim Stubbchair. A little bit of my background, I'm a retired civil engineer. I came to Santa Barbara, worked for the Flood Control District in 1958, and became the flood control engineer in charge of that in 1963. And in 1979, I also became responsible for the water agency. And the water was highly political at that time, as some of you remember. And those who weren't here can't believe how political it was. Well, anyway, when the board of supervisors gave me the water agency, I figured I'd last 2 years. Well, I lasted 10. And then after that, I became the manager of the Water Purveyors Agency, and we worked in administering the state water contract, studying alternatives for the state aqueduct and things like that. And I was involved in setting up CCWA, and then I was appointed to the State Water Resource Control Board, and I served 2 terms in Sacramento. So that was the end of my involvement in the local water scene. So my knowledge is stale, but I could barely hear what was going on here, but it sounds like some of the issues are still relevant. Okay, the talk that I was asked to give on the water history of Santa Barbara County was given to an aqua group up in Buellton in 2015. It was intended for an audience without local knowledge. Obviously, you folks have local knowledge. So some of what I say may be quite redundant. I'll go through it quickly if I can. But I also want to invite you to ask questions at any time. It's just a small group. And I've been asked to emphasize the San Ynez River aspect of my background. So we'll do that. And if we have any time left over, then I'll get to the State Water Project. Okay, now where's the clicker? This? Where? Sorry? All right. And can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, obviously Santa Barbara County is out on the corner of California. When Supervisors Bradbury and Twitchell were back fighting for the funding for Cachuma, President Truman referred to that as the corner of California. Okay, these are the 9 drainage regions of California. Santa Barbara County is in the Central Coast Drainage Region. Prior to 1997, when the state aqueduct was constructed, there were interbasin transfers between all basins, all regions, other than the Central Coast. There were no pipes in or out of the Central Coast. And during the 1990 drought, Mark Reisner, the author of Cadillac Desert, invited me to have lunch with him. We went out to Moby Dick's, and he told me, all we need to do is stop growing alfalfa in the Central Valley, and there will be plenty of water for the cities. So I said, how do we get the water here? Of course, he had no answer. There was no way to get it here. Okay, that's the rivers of the county. There are 4 rivers. The county line is the orange line. Cuyama River on the north, the Sisquoc below it. They have a confluence at Fugler's Point to form the Santa Maria River. Below that, we have the San Antonio Creek, which rises in just east of Los Alamos, flows through Los Alamos into the ocean at Vandenberg. South of that, the San Ynez River, we're familiar with. Then we have coastal streams. This is the watershed of the Cuyama and Sisquoc River. Cuyama is the largest watershed, 1,140 square miles. Sisquoc, 475, I guess. And you notice that the upper reaches of the Cuyama watershed are in Ventura County. It also extends into San Luis Obispo County on the north. That's San Antonio Creek, 165, this watershed. And the San Ynez is divided into the upper and lower regions or watersheds at Cachuma Dam, 480 below, 417 above. Then we have the upper San Ynez watershed, which is of the concern to us in the south coast. And that watershed, roughly 400 square miles, roughly 200 above Gibraltar and 400 above Cachuma. And then we have the coastal streams, which may be locally important, but they're not significant sources for the county-wide scale. They're very steep, carry a lot of debris, don't have good dam sites, but they do help in some cases on groundwater recharge. Now, there are 4 dams in the county, starting up at the Cuyama. That's Twitchell Dam. It was originally Vaquero Dam. Then, of course, we have Bradbury, originally Kachuma, then Gibraltar and Juncal. And then the groundwater basins. Let me see here, just a sec. Let's see. Yeah, groundwater is by far the largest supplier of water in the county. It's over 3/4 of the supply. And groundwater basins in North County have been, well, before state water anyway, they were declining. We'll get to that. And the quality was deteriorating. The pumping lifts were increasing. And, but anyway, at the time we did our studies in the 1980s, agricultural water use in the county was 275,000 acre feet, and the municipal industrial use was 56,000 acre feet, for a total of 331,000 acre feet. Let's see. Well, I missed a slide. Uh-oh. Well, anyway, that's the county rainfall isolated map that I just stole from the Water Agency Flood Control District website. And you can see, well, maybe you can't read it, but in the Lompoc and Santa Maria valleys, the rainfall is about 14 to 16 inches a year. Up in the Cuyama Valley, 8 to 10. The mountains behind us pretty high. And the upper San Ynez is the most productive watershed rainfall-wise. And speaking of rainfall, this is a plot of 148 years of rainfall from let me see, I can't quite read it, but it's 1868 to 2015, because I haven't updated since they gave that talk in 2015. You can see that the rainfall is highly variable. There was, I believe I heard a question, what's the trend of the rainfall? Is it going up or down? Well, I did a trend line, but I didn't plot it on here. It's going up. When I arrived here, the average rainfall was in the 17 inches. Now it's 18.1, at least through 15. And the average rainfall, as I said, is 18.1. The median is 15.5. Now, at flood control, we used to have a rainfall pool. At the beginning of the rainfall season, we'd say, okay, put $1 in the pot and see who comes the closest. So if you were going to guess the rainfall, what would you guess? 15. Anyone else? This year? Any year. Any year.
I think the previous year is pretty good predictor.
Okay, whatever. Okay. All right. Well, here's the rainfall divided into 1-inch class intervals. And I don't know if you can read it clearly, but the mode, the most frequently observed value is 14 inches in a year, and 13 inches, the 15 inches occurs 13 times, and the average rainfall of 18 inches occurs in only 5 of the years, 5 of the 148 years. And obviously the distribution is skewed because you can't have less than 0 rainfall, but there's theoretically no upper limit to the rainfall, so you have a skewed distribution. Now, on this slide, I drew a line at 14 inches, a red line. That's because the evapotranspiration of the native vegetation in Southern California is generally around 14 inches. You don't get any runoff or deep percolation before the rainfall exceeds 14 inches. So I subtracted the all rainfall less than 14. That's the red line. That's the potential runoff. Now, it's not linear. If you get 15 inches of rain, 1 inch over that, you're not going to get a lot. But it goes up, well, on a curve, you might say. All right. And that yellow, let's see here. it's hard to see, but there's a shaded yellow area between 1945 and 1952. Well, that was the critical period for Kachuma when it was designed. And we'll get to that later. All right, so it's the wet years that give us our water supply, both groundwater and surface water. And there's enough water in the San Ynez River watershed over a long term to justify having a dam that's bigger than the present Kachuma. This is the Lompoc Valley in February '69. I took that picture. It's just looking upstream from surf, and the airport was '67. Now, agriculture in Santa Barbara County and water use, of course, in the Spanish days, it was mainly growing cattle for hides so they could put the hides on ships, send them back to Boston, have them made into shoes, then bring the shoes back and sell them to the locals. That's been written up in several books. But cattle ranching took a big hit in the drought that followed the 1862 flood. The 1862 flood was very large. It's almost legendary. That caused Sacramento up there to be raised, filled in downtown one level, one story. And Humpy Campbell was a supervisor who represented the Buellton, San Ynez, lower San Ynez River area early in my career here. And he told me he had spoken with an Indian, Native American, who remembered the 1862 flood. And he said it was from hill to hill at Buellton. Gives an idea. So anyway, the drought in 1864 basically ended this part. And then the Santa Maria and Lompoc valleys started growing row crops as opposed to tree crops. And around let me see, I have some more notes here, talking points. Let's see. Okay. So extensive irrigation began about 1900. The groundwater basins were full, and some areas were even artesian. And so you could just dig a pit, basically, and get water. And that almost would be like the condition in the upper slide here. Any salts that came into the basin were washed through by the continuing outflow, so the water quality remained suitable for agriculture. Then as deep well pumps became available, they started lowering the water level and even got below sea level in some basins here in the South Coast. And so the quality, the salts were no longer washed out. They began to accumulate, so the lower reaches of Santa Ynez and Santa Maria rivers couldn't grow some crops because of the water was just too salty. Okay. Then the Kachuma Project history. That was the main topic of my previous talk. And a lot of you folks know this. How many of you have read Tom Stork's California Editor, if anyone? Because a lot of the information I got from that era came from that book. Anyone in the audience? No, okay. Well, okay, in 1782, the Spaniards came, the mission was developed, and they diverted from Mission Creek for irrigation and grinding grain, get some power. But the Mission Dam Reservoir were not sufficient. Additional supplies were needed as the Americans began to take over. The population began to increase. And in 1888, the city engineer made the first of many water surveys. There were many water studies done in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and he concluded that water was going to waste in the San Ynez River and needed to be brought to the south coast. That was pretty early. And then the Cold Spring Tunnel was drilled. It was a horizontal well into the mountains, but it could not be extended through to the San Ynez River. In 1896, cities proposed the Juncal Dam and Tunnel. And again, in early 1900s, there were many studies and led to the drilling of the Mission Tunnel all the way through to the river in 1912. And then in 1820, Gibraltar Dam was constructed. And over there on the side, I don't know if you can read it. Let me see if I could find that here. It's the quotation. That's the, yeah, okay. I'll read it. Santa Barbara, California. Bent Brothers, Los Angeles, were low bidders and were awarded the contract at $342,981 for the construction of Gibraltar Dam. Then it says there were other bidders who were higher. And the work will require 45,000 cubic yards of concrete. The city will furnish the cement. The estimated time for completion ranges between 450 and 500 days. Okay. And then in 1928, as it said, the city sold the Juncal Dam site to Montecito. And is anyone familiar with the Jin Chao water right? Yeah, I figured you all were. Well, anyway, that case basically decided that water had to be put to beneficial use or it could be appropriated. And so a lot of folks down the San Ynez River did not like the idea of Gibraltar Dam, but Jin Chao gave the city the rights to take the surplus water. And then in 1930, Montecito Water District did complete Juncal Dam. They used the Dalton Tunnel. Now in 1938, well, the water shortages continued here in the South Coast. In 1938, the Board of Supervisors authorized a water supply study by Leeds, Hill, and Jewett, I think it was, a Los Angeles firm. And they reported their findings in 1939 that groundwater levels were dropping at an alarming rate. There was not sufficient water supply locally. Gibraltar was inadequate for local needs, and additional supplies would have to come from the San Ynez River. Recommendations were to raise Gibraltar Dam, which was done in 1949, and a new dam at the Tecapa site on the San Ynez River, which was not done at that time anyway. And as you know, I didn't mention this on the previous slide, but Lippincott, a fellow named Lippincott, was a very prominent consulting engineer, and he warned the city of the siltation of Gibraltar before it was built. Because Gibraltar is a relatively small dam on a 200 square mile watershed, generates a lot of sediment. But anyway, in 1940-41, the Board of Supervisors contracted with the Bureau of Reclamation and the USGS for a county-wide master plan. County-wide, not just South Coast. That first one, which is the cover, which is illustrated, was just the South Coast. So the Bureau of Reclamation studied it for about 3 years and issued a report in 1944, which was published in the news press, and then the county had a summary of the a pamphlet prepared from the news press and distributed it. There was the proposed Santa Barbara County Water Program little pamphlet, which I have, and it was written by George Clyde, who became a supervisor and eventually the chair of both the Flood Control District and the Water Agency, and he was a good friend of mine, fine person. There's a list there of the dams that were proposed, and I'm going to go through them on the next slide. This is the map, a scan of the map from that pamphlet, and again, it may be hard to read. Well, I'll go back. It is too hard to read. There were 3 dams proposed on the San Ynez River: Camuesa, which is kind of in the middle of Gibraltar Reservoir, Tecapas or Cachuma, downstream near the present Cachuma, and Santa Rosa, down near Lompoc. 1 dam on South Spoitas Creek, which is a tributary to the San Ynez River, joins the San Ynez River just east of Lompoc by Highway 1. And there are 2 dams on the Cuyama River, the Vaquero Dam, just above the confluence with the Sisquoc, and then a debris reservoir upstream of that. And then 1 dam on the Sisquoc River at the Round Corral site. Now let's see if this, let me get out my pointer. Let's see. Oh, here it is. Let's see. Well, it really doesn't show up very well. All right. The dams highlighted in green, the dams and other systems highlighted in green, I hear, were constructed. No, sorry, yellow, just reverse. The ones in yellow were constructed. The ones in green were not constructed. The Twitchell Reservoir, Vaquero Reservoir, is subject to heavy siltation, and the Bureau recognized it was going to need a silt dam upstream, and Pro said it would be needed in about 50 years, and it is, but it wasn't constructed, and I don't know of any plans to construct it. On the Round Corral site, let's go back a little history. In the 1930s and 40s, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Corps of Engineers were competitors for water resource projects, bitter competitors. And Twitchell wanted flood control supervisor, Presker from Santa Maria, Supervisor Presker from Santa Maria wanted flood control and water supply for the Santa Maria Valley because the groundwater basins were overdrafted and losing quality. And the Corps of Engineers wanted to build a levee to provide the flood protection. Well, he wanted some storage for water conservation. And the Corps wouldn't build a reservoir, or couldn't build a reservoir, for anything other than flood control. So they got the Bureau of Reclamation involved, and they split the baby, you might say. They built the levee and they built Twitchell Reservoir, but they did not build the Round Corral Reservoir. Okay, and then down at the Santa Rosa site, which is if you follow just above that, just above the arrow, that's the Santa Rosa Dam site. Yeah, thank you. Okay, you have an arrow. Thank you. Okay, you can be my arrow operator. Okay. Now, that actually did go to study to be constructed. In 1965, going through my notes, the Water Agency actually had the aerial survey topo map prepared for that area. It was going to be called the Narrows Dam on the San Ynez River. And it turned out to be a pretty inefficient dam because it was relatively shallow, lots of evaporation losses. It would have flooded out all sorts of Class 1 farmland. And in order to make the economics work, the Bureau of Reclamation projected more visitor days than Yosemite National Park. Okay, so that did not happen. And also, dam on South Zapuetas did not happen. Let's see where we are now. Oh, the Cachuma project history. I asked if anyone had read California Editor, which is a source of a lot of this information. By Tom Stork was the publisher of the News Press, which was very powerful in those days. He had a lot of connections in the Washington level, and it's an interesting read. But anyway, 1945, it was necessary to have local agencies who could contract with the Bureau for the water and the repayment of the proposed works. And so the Water Agency was founded by an act of the legislature. Montecito and the city have already existed, of course, but I think Goleta, Montecito, Summerlin, and Carpinteria needed to form water districts, which they did. And I don't know about La Cumbre Mutual. Is La Cumbre Mutual a Cachuma contractor? Hope Ranch? No.
The state water, though.
Okay. I know they are for state water. Okay. So in 1946, a dam at the Comesa site was rejected. And then I don't remember the exact, well, I wasn't here, so of course I don't remember the reason. but in 46, then they proposed a Cachuma with 275,000 acre-feet of storage, and that was rejected by the city and the water district. They thought it was too big. It would have cost $2 million more to be repaid over 40 years at no interest. The yield would have been 10,000 acre-feet more, and the having a bigger reservoir doesn't generate more silt, so the silt impact on the reservoir would have been much less over a long period of time. But anyway, that was so. Then the Bureau went back to the drawing board. They came up with alternatives for Kachuma and Tecapis. Anyone want to know where Tecapis is? County Park, basically. Kachuma Park. Okay. And so a 210,000 acre foot Kachuma was selected after it got built. I think it turned out to be 205,000, but close enough. And the water districts in the city approved, and the water agency approved. And there was an election. Let's see, is that the next slide? No. Okay, there was an election, and the election was bitterly fought, as outlined by Tom Stork. Some people just did not want that dam built. A rich guy from the east who bought a ranch that was going to be affected by Kachuma especially. So that's interesting to read about. And Kachuma was given priority over other projects. We'll get to that a little bit later. 48 Kachuma project was authorized, and the election was in 49. Okay. Then in 1949 to 52, Congress appropriated funds. Now, it was easy to get Congress to authorize a project, but very difficult to get the money appropriated and have it stay in the budget. The first year it was $1 million. I think in 51 it was $10 million, which President Truman struck from the budget. And I believe that Twitchell and Bradbury talked to him to put him back in. So this is the three elements of the Kachuma project were the dam, the Teclode Tunnel, and the South Coast Conduit. And I found this to be pretty interesting. This is an Association of Western State Engineers proceedings. They met here in Santa Barbara in 1952, and the regional director of the Bureau of Reclamation presented a paper. And it's interesting because it was real-time views of the situation, not historical, not projected. And I don't think you can read those some of those highlighted elements. So I'm going to see if I can find it, read it on my iPad. Okay. Okay. Now in the highlighted portion. Now in 1941, county supervisors asked the Bureau to come in here and develop this plan of water conservation for them. This was the last step in a long struggle of water on the part of Santa Barbara County, particularly on the part of the South Coast area. The struggle started in 1782 when the mission was founded, etc., and it's gone on ever since. Let's see if I can get the bottom part here. Gibraltar Dam carried the city along basically pretty well. But by 1945, 46, and 47, many of the wells put down by the agricultural interests went below sea level anywhere from 10 to as much as 45 or 50 feet. It was a losing game. In 1945, after 4 years of work with the local people in developing our plans, we had an overall county plan pretty well developed. By 1945, however, the situation was so serious here on the South Coast that it was decided that the county and Bureau should go ahead and do an emergency job on the South Coast. The next page. And the Kachuma was under construction at the time he did this. He said, basically, learning from Gibraltar Dam, we provided 35,000 acre feet of capacity for silt in Kachuma. Well, I don't know if that's been considered in operation studies. I don't think so. But anyway, when the project is done, we should be in pretty good shape for water supply anywhere from 40 to 50 years. So it wasn't expected to be the end all. of water development for the South Coast. And then we have had a lesson as far as we are concerned in the importance of intelligent development and leadership with the county officials. One of the problems the county supervisors and the people of this county had to develop when an emergency arose here on the South Coast. Because of the serious water situation, it was desirable to go ahead with South Coast development as rapidly as possible and leave the north part of the county without a project and without a report for a long time, for the time being. The people representing the northern part of Santa Barbara County were objective and pretty public-minded. They recognized the immediate need was here, and they not only allowed the Cachuma project to get ahead, but they did a terrific job of supporting it, knowing that it would be their turn later. So then I look at what's happening in our political situation now at a higher level, and where's the public spirit gone? Anyway, end of political comment. Oh, let's see, where are we? Okay. The dam was under construction in 1952. When the 1952 floods occurred, they would have filled Cachuma had it existed, but it didn't exist. But they were said to be the worst floods since 1914. And there was a lot of flooding here on the South Coast. The creeks had not been cleared, and it led to the formation of the Flood Control District. Santa Barbara County Flood Control Water Conservation District was a result of the 1952 floods to clear the creeks. And now you try to clear the creeks, can you do it? But it's gone far beyond that. And in 1953, the project was completed, and then they waited for the reservoir to fill. And Stork was ridiculed. They said it's a monument to the WPA on a dry river. If you can't fill Gibraltar, how can you fill Cachuma? And things like that. But then, I think it's in January of 58, Cachuma was at 26,000 acre feet, pretty empty. And then it filled and spilled on April 12th, 1958, the month before we came to Santa Barbara. In 71, the dam was renamed for Bradbury. Now, the design Cachuma yield was 33,000 acre feet per year. And there's a graph there of calculated water levels had Cachuma been in effect from let's see. I need to look at, I can't quite read it. They had stream flow records from 1908 to 1947. And so they did a yield study and determined that 33,000 acre feet per year. And the critical period then was 1927 to 36, it looks like. And I won't go through the math, but it's just standard reservoir calculations, yield determinations. And then 1974, 75, the Bureau reanalyzed the yield of Cachuma. And they had quite a few more years of record. The original record was at the top, the longer record at the bottom. Well, it turned out that while they were designing Cachuma, they were in the middle of a new critical period. So from 45 to 50, let's see, excuse me a second. Yeah, from 45 to 52 was the new critical period, and the yield went down to 27,800 acre feet per year. Actually, they stated it was 34,300,000 cubic meters per year, because that was the era when we were trying to go metric. Okay. And then leaving Cachuma, going to the Gibraltar Pass-Through Agreement. In 1953, the city had agreed to strengthen Gibraltar Dam for seismic safety purposes, and they also wanted to raise the dam 20 feet to offset the loss of storage due to sedimentation, and they hired consultants to do this, and the consultants were giving a report to the city council. I was sitting in the audience. I had not been involved in the process at all, but listened to all these alternatives that were being presented. They had big problems with the least bell vireo, who were in the delta at the upper end of the reservoir, endangered species. But one thing they did not consider was a reoperation of the reservoir. And the water agency had the San Ynez River operations model was started before my involvement, but it was a monthly model and covered everything from end to end. And you could use it to analyze and predict yields. You could change operations of reservoirs and see what the results were. This model was originally in Hewlett-Packard BASIC, which was allowed a letter and a number as variables, only a letter and a number. And I started looking at that, and you couldn't. It made no sense. It wasn't documented very well. So I had the flu one weekend, and I translated it from Hewlett-Packard BASIC to Microsoft Quick BASIC, where you could use long variable names, say Kachuma yield instead of C1, stuff like that, and made it basically self-documenting. So I had a fairly good concept of what the model could do. So after this meeting with the city, I went home and I ran some studies taking less from Gibraltar and more from Kachuma to see if it hurt anyone else. And it didn't. It was possible to pass water through Gibraltar and take it from Kachuma. And so I wrote a memo, I think it was to Dave Johnson, who was the I called him city engineer. He's probably Public Works Director. Okay. And the city followed through and hired some consultants. And the hydraulic committee, they asked the hydrology committee. We had a hydrology committee guiding the development of this computer model. It had a representative from Stetson Engineers representing the San Ynez Riverside. His name was Ali Sharudi. And then Bill Mills was kind of representing the South Coast side technically. And so the model studies were done from 87 to 89. I think it led to the pass-through agreement. But you can correct me if I anyway, so that was a bit of history. And then, who here was involved in the dredging at Gibraltar? Anyone? You were here, of course. Anyone else? Okay. Well, just, you can add to what I say then. In 1979, well, the city has always been interested in how can we restore storage capacity to Gibraltar. In 1979, they got a federal Clean Lakes grant to do some experimental dredging at Gibraltar. Now, the sediments in Gibraltar were contaminated, so they wanted as little water being moved with a slurry as possible. So they used a pneumatic method using compressed air, which supposedly got to about 40 or 50% solids. They developed a disposal area on the north side of the lake and dredged 713 acre feet of sediment. And the cost in today's dollars was $5,000 to $7,000 per acre foot of sediment dredged. And the report that I read, contemporary report, said in 1983 that the city entered into a contract to purchase the equipment to continue the dredging operation. I don't think that happened. I think the minute the federal dollars dried up, it stopped. Is that right? Right, okay. And, all right, now, talking about operations, I think you were talking a little bit about operating Kachuma this year. It's an ongoing question. Now, safe yield operations, I think you all know it. You take the so-called safe yield from the reservoir as determined by the studies that the Bureau had done, and then, but what do you do if you're in the 6th year, the critical period is 7 years, and you don't know if it's going to be an 8-year or a 9-year or a 10-year drought, so what do you do? So the prudent thing to me is, of course, take less and save something for the next year. But it's not the same thing for all agencies. If you were a metropolitan water district and you could get water, you wanted as much water as you could from the State Water Project, and then if you get less from the State Water Project, you take it from the Colorado River and your groundwater storage and all your reservoirs. But if you're an agency that doesn't have alternatives, you want a conservative operation. So there are conflicts. But in the 87 to 92 drought, the managers met periodically at Caro's in Goleta to discuss things, and they'd invite me occasionally. And so we began talking about when do you start taking shortages as the drought progressed. And so they agreed to begin shortages when the reservoir reached 100,000 acre-feet, which was essentially half full. It was really, I think the capacity at that time was down to 184,000 acre-feet because of siltation after the 69 floods. But anyway, basically half full. You start taking shortages. I think they agreed on 20% shortages, though I'm not positive. So that was a start. But if you took that rule curve and applied it to the recent drought, it wouldn't have been sufficient. But it would have been better than nothing, in my opinion. Okay, let's see. All right. Well, this is awkward to see, but I prepared a spreadsheet. It was Lotus at the time. It was before Excel, where we took all the variables or constants or factors on the left there were involved in the operation of Cachuma, and prepared a spreadsheet initially covered 3 years on a month-by-month basis, and you could vary the percent shortage you wanted to take and see what the results would be. And I embedded an Excel. I'm a novice at this PowerPoint stuff, but I embedded an Excel spreadsheet in here, and I'm going to see if it will work. No, it just I just want to go backwards. How can I? Well, just in case it didn't work, I prepared 2 slides. And it didn't work, but I was going to let you play games with various shortages in real time. But this is the projected 1990 to 92 levels in Cachuma, based upon, this one is based upon zero take. And there were still, you had downstream water rights, there were no fish releases at that time. But you had evaporation, things like that were going to cause the reservoir to go down whether you took any water or not. So this was with zero take, and this was with 30% take, assuming there was no rain during those 2 years. And if rain had occurred, you could put the value in the proper cell in the spreadsheet, the curves would adjust. So this was just a way to visualize the effects of various operations. And then in 1996, I'd left the local scene, but I was still interested in this study. So I ran the San Ynez River model under many different scenarios, testing the drought at different times, and then get the results, see what would have happened if we had this reduction factor. And I put all those points on the spreadsheet, and I did a curve fit to them and came up with this parabolic equation. It starts at, starts at 100,000 acre-feet and goes down to zero. So the Cachuma level is on the x-axis from 0 up to 120,000 acre-feet, and the delivery factor is on the y-axis, goes from 0 to 100. And looking at this curve, it's not a magic bullet. It's just an attempt to come up with something rational. Looking at it now after 21 years, it could just well be a straight line. It doesn't need to be a parabola. Okay. Any questions? Am I boring the Dickens out here? Okay. Well, then I would talk about my experience on the San Ynez. After the 69, well, the Bureau, the Water Agency hired an engineer named Bob Edmonston. You may know him because he served on the Montecito Water District Board toward the end of his life, and very fine engineer. And he was hired as the engineer, as the water agency's consulting engineer. Well, he and I got together after the 69 floods and toward the end of the spill period. In 69, it spilled for a long time. And so why don't we ask the Bureau to surcharge the reservoir 6 inches and we'll get 1,500 acre feet. The reservoir area was 3,000 acre feet. 1,500 acre feet for free, basically. So the Bureau regional office referred it to the engineering office in Denver, and they said, no, no, but hell no. Don't ask us again. And because I have a picture of the gates there. The gates have a thrust bearing. They're radial gates, and they have a bearing, and they said that the bearings wouldn't take the 6-inch load safely, which I thought was phooey. But anyway, then in 1973, I was up sitting in the gatehouse on the dam with the dam tender, watching the reservoir rise. When the reservoir reaches 750 feet, the gates are supposed to start opening on about a 3-to-1 basis. And there's a system of floats and pulleys that do that on an automatic basis. It can also be boosted by power. It can operate by power. Well, got over 750. It kept going up and up and up. But the Bureau wanted to see if the automatic system was going to work. So finally, when it got to 750.63, which is more than 6 inches, the gate started opening. So, and the bearings didn't fail. But I understand that since then, there's been a lot of progress in operating the reservoir. Now, in 1969, there were 3 major inflows. There were 3 major rainfall events. January 8th, one started January 18th, one January 24th, and the other February 24th. The first one was on a dry watershed and just basically primed the watershed, not allowed a runoff. But the second one resulted in the flood of record to date. It was about maybe 100,000 cubic feet per second in and about 80,000 out. There was some downstream claim it was more than that. And a lot of debris washed into the reservoir. Outhouses from the Paradise area, things like that, were floating in the lake. And there were many acres of debris to be removed. So we asked the equivalent of FEMA at the time to please help us clean the reservoir. And they said no, there's no health threat. And then somebody found a floating dead pig. And we took a Polaroid picture of that, showed it to FEMA, and they approved the cleaning of the reservoir. And I think the amount was $300,000 at that time, but that's $2 million in today's money. And what they did, they got a bunch of World War II amphibious trucks called ducks, 2.5-ton amphibious trucks, put trash racks on the front end, and pushed the debris up on the old highway where it was ramped out of the lake, the highway that was bypassed. Another thing that comes up frequently in droughts is, why don't you just excavate the lake while it's low and create more storage? Okay. So I did a little study, and it was published in the news press. It's just not cost effective. Even if you had a place to put the sediment, you need, to get an acre foot of yield, you need 10 acre feet of storage. And then anyway, it just wasn't feasible. It's still not feasible. And then there's no body contact sport in Cachuma. But when we moved here in '58, you could go swimming in, I call it the Stilling Pool. At the end of the spillway, they had a pool, and it was open for swimming. I don't know, is it open for swimming now? Still is, okay.
Well, I don't know if it's open for swimming, but it's still there.
Yeah, it's still there. I know it's there, but is it open for swimming?
I don't think so.
No, I don't either.
We just removed a bunch of bass and carp from that.
You did, bass and carp.
Huge ton.
Okay. Now, am I out of time?
You've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Cachuma operations. At the 1969 flood, I called the downstream areas, tell them a flood was coming. We didn't know how big it was going to be, but we knew it was going to be worse than the 1938 flood. And I called down about 4 in the morning, and said the flood be there about 3 p.m. So what did they do? People went out in the valley to see the flood. No reaction. Just the opposite of what should have happened. Vandenberg Air Force Base, their building where they had unbacked up tapes, was walls were pushed in. It was flooded down there in the lower valley, South Vandenberg. So we decided that we needed a flood warning system. So we developed that. And part of that was flood, predicting the flood flow, the inflows from rainfall. And I developed that curve. The big thing there is how do you determine how much of the rainfall is going to run off? So it's a soil moisture calculation, stuff like that. So it's based on what's called an antecedent index. And if you look at the Flood Control District's morning report or reservoir status, you'll see that antecedent index is there. And you can judge whether the watershed's wet or dry or not so dry. The antecedent index is the amount of inches of rain it takes to give 1 inch of runoff. Well, that's an essential part of this computer model. And then once you know how much rain is going to run off, you can distribute it using a unit graph method. And I have a slide here showing the results in the 78 flood. They were uncannily accurate. It was just luck, not just skill, I'm convinced. But anyway, that system is established and working. And as part of that, we had a hydrologic data collection system, telemeter system. So this was in the days when AT&T controlled the telephone networks, and they wouldn't allow foreign devices to be wired into their network. So we'd have a regular cradle telephone there. You call it up, and the cradle would be lifted up by a device off the cradle, and then the telemeter device would start beeping, and you count the beeps. You know, beep, 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 then you know the Kachuma level. And the same thing applied to rainfall gauges. Now it's progressed far beyond that. We started. Well, anyway, it's really well established now. You can see all this on the Flood Control District website. And I just have to mention Twitchell. Do I have time to mention Twitchell? 2 minutes. All right.
Would appreciate a couple minutes on the state water. I mean, for us, what's
State
key
water
for
would
us?
be more interesting
Can
to
you
us.
give us a
State
couple of
water?
minutes on state water?
Well, if you want 2 minutes on the state water, I'm just going to have to skip through to a single slide.
There you go.
there you
Let's
go.
see. Way at the end. Whoops.
You went too far.
Whoops,
You can
sorry.
go back.
I'm trying to go back.
You can go back.
Go back. Can't go back?
Way fast forward, yeah.
Wait, I'll tell you in just a second.
Here you go.
Okay, let's see.
By the way, the antecedent.
There, the 2 minutes are up,
index-
sorry.
The antecedent index right now is 11.5, right? Somewhere in there.
Yeah, okay.
It's pretty dry.
That's pretty dry.
Yeah.
I presume, well, all right. The state water project's designed to move water from northern California, where most of the runoff is, to southern California, where most of the people are. And part of that was the Coastal Branch Aqueduct, which is in red there, which to serve Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo counties. It was contract was negotiated by Edmonston. Santa Barbara County didn't need the water at the time the state water project was constructed, so they had the right to defer the construction, but they still had to pay certain costs. And there was an election. Let's see. All right. Yeah. Well, there's a lot to this, but the flood control district had the state water contract rather than the water agency because the county council and district attorney was combined at the time, thought that the interest-free status of the Kachuma project loan would be jeopardized if the water agency contracted for state water. So the contract was done with the flood control district, not the water agency. And in 1979, there was an election on state water, and it was defeated. So people thought that was the end of state water, and it's time to dump the entitlement. A lot of interest in no-growth people wanted to dump the entitlement entirely. That's when I became responsible for the water agency. And the water purveyors, generally speaking, did not want to get rid of it because they were short of water. They needed water. So we sent out, we polled all the purveyors asking how much, if any, state water they would be interested in having. And the results are on the left side of this slide. It totaled up to be 45,486 feet, and we had a total entitlement of 57,700, so there's 12,000 acre feet left over. So then the board was being pushed to get state water off the tax roll. It was 2 to 3 cents. It was called the Feather River Project on your tax bill. And so the purveyors who expressed interest in the state water were asked, would you be willing to assume the costs of it, basically, through water supply retention agreements, and they were. And so the control of the state water project was transferred from the board of directors of the flood control district to the water purveyors. The water purveyors had a agency they worked through. I was the manager of the water purveyors agency, and it handled the state water contacts for Santa Barbara contractors. And then there was another election in 91. This is at the end of a drought. The 79 election was at the end of a wet period, so you can see what happens. Anyway, so the elections were successful in all areas of the county except for the Lompoc area. And here in Santa Barbara, you want to tell the story? You had desal.
There was an alternative desal provision or ballot measure. It actually when it was first drafted, it had a poison pill in it, meaning that if it got more votes, it would kill state water. And when it got submitted, the clerk basically found that there had been irregularities in the collection of the signatures. It wasn't phrased right, so it dropped off the ballot as a mandatory measure and became an advisory measure only. And I think it did get more votes, but now it didn't have the poison pill and state water was approved.
Yeah, I remember there was a poison pill.
Yeah.
My recollection was that it was made mandatory. It got on the ballot through a citizen petition.
It was through
council
gathering.
action.
Yeah, it was through gathering signatures. The state water was by council action. The other one was by gathering signatures.
Okay. All right. So anyway, we went through the planning and environmental studies that led to the construction of the aqueduct. That could take an hour to just tell all that stuff. So state water was constructed. I remember I spoke at the completion ceremony, the dedication ceremony. One thing I said was, now that the prospect of having an 8 or 9 year drought on a 7-year reservoir isn't quite so bad.
Yeah.
That's not the word I used, but anyway, so end of presentation. You have questions?
Questions? Actually,
Yeah, thank you.
Jim, it's really incredible to have you back here and have this presentation. I know from all of us, it's an incredible bank of knowledge, which again, we just can't thank you more than that. And
Well, I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
It's really great. And again, for me personally, I enjoyed working with you at a time, even though we butted heads quite a bit
Yeah, yeah,
back in the day.
yeah.
Very.
One quick question. So what is the status of the nominal safe yield of the Kachuma project now? We went from 33,000
I
to
don't.
27?
I don't know. I've been out of it since '92. I suspect there's been another operation study, maybe two. You could say.
Kelly?
Kelly Dyer, Water Supply Manager. The current operational yield is 25,714. But I know that there's an interest in revisiting that. We have a number of environmental requirements that we're facing with the draft order for the water rights of the Kachuma project and also the biological opinion. So the safe yield will depend on the outcome of those as well.
I have one more comment.
Go ahead, Jim.
The result of the alternative study was that an enlarged Kachuma was the preferred alternative for the South Coast rather than water from the aqueduct itself. And it seems strange to me that state water seemed to have growth hormone in it, but Kachuma water didn't in the same quantity.
Yeah.
But and anyway, I personally lobbied the chair and the board members of the State Water Resource Control Board to see if they could expedite the water rights hearing for the enlarged Kachuma. They couldn't do it. So when Santa Maria gave notice they were proceeding with the design and construction of the state aqueduct, the South Coast had 6 months to either get on the train or miss the train. And so they went through a crash period of crash EIR for the Coastal Branch extension, and results are what they are.
And I think I've made comments during this particular drought that, in fact, and again, came from discussions here, that if we had not had the plumbing in order to transfer water through the state, we would not have made it through the drought the way we did. And so it turned out to be a blessing to handle the crisis that we didn't see coming at us. So, again, Bendy, any final comment?
Well, just to thank Jim. Believe it or not, Jim has slowed down. You can imagine what he was like 40 years ago.
Yeah.
I had the privilege of butting heads with him and being taught by him when he was starting in flood control. And it's just neat that you're here to present, and we've got this now captured. I'd love to get that last piece, where you sort of started skipping ahead, to get that nailed down into the full story. So I hope that we can finish off this piece, not now, because we're going to run out of time, but because this, for the long term, is something that people should be looking at to get educated about our water supply.
Totally.
It is in the PowerPoint.
I hear that, but we want your story, and I hope that we can all do that together. Get this full story, because it's such a wonderful story, and you present it so well.
Yeah, the oral history, to capture that oral history would be really great. Jim, thank you again so much. Merry Christmas, Jim.
Yeah, thank you. Same to you.
Okay. That takes us to item 7, the Water Resources Manager's Report.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, you have in your packet today the Water Resources Manager's Report. I'm just going to walk through and highlight a few elements of that report. You'll notice as of November, we took very little water out of the Kachuma project. We've been relying mostly on Gibraltar, desal, and state water. That's been making up the bulk of our supply for November. Desal production for November was 108 acre feet. And as we continue to work through some of those little issues, it'll continue to approach that 260 acre feet, which we're looking for there. Recycled water remains stable or as predicted, and we are producing no groundwater. Actually, we had 31 acre feet of groundwater, and that was the result of bringing the facility online and, again, just testing it, making sure it was ready to be available for us.
Joshua, sorry, I should have asked this before, but regarding the Thomas Fire, where is the water coming from for them to fight the fires, and how does that impact our resources on the South Coast for water this year?
So the bulk of it, it may seem like there was a lot of water dumped on the fire, but when it comes down to it, it adds up to very little water. In fact, evap completely is much more significant. I think for the Ray Fire, the state had followed up us and said, "Hey, we used 4 acre feet of your water. Do you want to get repaid for it?" And no, thank you for putting the fire out. We'll be okay. And so the bulk, I understand, has been coming from Kachuma, but again, I think they are tracking it. But I would guess it would be, we're talking less than 10 acre feet of water was used. So it's a pretty surgical and small amount. And when you think about evap is hundreds of acre feet. It's nothing. I'm not gonna. We went over this graphic earlier in the drought presentation. We'll skip on to the city's gallons per capita per day. Again, interesting to watch as we are continue to drop. It's kind of flattening out, but we're at 77 gallons per capita per day is our 12-month running average, and we are clearly exceeding our 2020 goal, which was 117 gallons per capita per day. I'm not going to go over these again. We saw the temperature, precipitation. It's actually, we didn't see the temperature. They're predicting above average temperatures for the next 3 months, which, as we talked about a little earlier, just serves to kind of exacerbate the low rainfall. As far as Kachuma, we do see that dip. The downstream users, we just got to the summer, large downstream release. I think it approached somewhere around 20,000. So a little less than that. Okay. And then, of course, we're hoping that thing's going to pop back up again. In your packet, and I wasn't going to go into any details on this, it's just our monitoring of our groundwater basins. In particular, Mr. Keller loves to look through these and he's got some questions for us. Did want to talk a little bit about wastewater flows. As it looks on here, it looks fairly stable, but it's been really interesting to see if it made it in here. It didn't quite make it in here. I had added a graphic showing the evacuation, which is really, you can tell a lot from our wastewater. And one of the other factors has been we've had a huge drop in our wastewater flows, and it's the lowest I've ever seen. It was 4.8 MGD. So keep in mind, in 2010, on a regular basis, we were pushing about 10 MGD through our wastewater treatment plant, so a half of what we've seen, and that's really remarkable. So anyway, just another interesting tidbit. As far as sanitary sewer overflows, we are currently at 13, but we haven't had a spill now for the last 4 months. Yes, knock on wood. And I think keeping in mind that 3 of those spills were the result of the February 17th rain event, where it was a 25-year rain event and caused rain-related spills. So that puts us at around 10, and our goal was 8. So we're getting there, and I still believe we're on the right track, and we're going to be coming back in the coming months and talking a little bit more about all the stuff that we're doing in the collection system to continue to try and reduce those numbers. As far as the recycled water system goes, we're meeting all demands with that. And as we normally see this time of year, demands are dropping off. And then, as a final comments, I did want to just...
Great picture.
We dug up some great pictures. Bendy, thank you so very much for all the help and support you have given to this community related to water. I have had the great privilege of working with you, and it has been an honor to have someone so supportive of us during such a difficult time. Your tenure is 14 years as a water commissioner during the last drought. How remarkable to have you on this council doing that. And just in the water commission role, and then as our liaison to this board, has been really powerful, very supportive all the time, always looking for ways to build us up and push us forward, setting the bar high, pushing our other water agencies, really digging in to get to know this. The time commitment to be the liaison for city council to all these committees is significant. I don't know about the other roles that the other commissioners or other liaisons play, but we're talking at least 4 or 5 meetings a month, and that's outside of council, and then all the prep. And as we talk about these water issues, there's so much to them, and the thoughtfulness, Bendy, that you put into these has just been incredible, and it has been an honor. We have a card here for you from staff, and we also thought it fitting. There was a poem actually written for the hydroelectric facility, which Bendy, Councilmember White, was very involved in and helped us to get back on track. It was a hydroelectric facility that was decommissioned and for good reason, but needed to be brought back. And it actually, I was hoping to have the information here today. that hydroelectric facility has been basically covering all of our electrical needs, the city's electrical needs related to Cater, and we're going to have a little kind of summary on that. But it has been amazing, the renewable energy that that facility puts out. And as a result of the ribbon cutting we had a few years ago, we had a poem done for it. And so I just wanted to give that as a token of our appreciation, along with a card. And then we have some refreshments afterwards, and I know Chair Davis wanted to say a few things.
Yeah, well, I think other commissioners also. Michael?
Am I up?
Go ahead.
So I'm probably sitting here because of you and having watched you on Planning Commission 12 plus years ago. But I really just had two stories to tell you on what I'll take from the time we've spent together. And one of those is, I think you've heard me say before, that the unanimity for its sake, I think, is overrated. And I love a good argument, which I know you know. But throughout the course of watching you, I've always been impressed with that when you make an argument, it's not just for making an argument, and it's to get to somewhere, to get to an end result that works and usually works for both parties. And that's often difficult when people have egos or agendas or whatever. But that I think is one of the biggest takeaways I've taken away, both in sitting in roles like this and even at home. And the other one is another one that I think will last even longer, and that has to do with Veronica Meadows. And that to me was an eye opener in not letting impatience to make an improvement deter you from having patience to do something better. And I think that lesson can be in any role of anybody's life, home, personal, professional. And that particular situation, I think, is so far in the present day history of Santa Barbara undervalued, the role you played in that based on where we ended up. And 20 or 30 years from now, I think your name will be associated with that valley, and rightfully so. And I just want to thank you for at least spending the time. And I think I'm not alone probably in the effect you've had personally on people, in the role they play in the community, in the role with their family, in their interpersonal relations. And I will miss you, but I hope you're not gone. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Betty, mine's a little bit more personal. 35 years I've worked with you. Over 35 years, which is 2 major droughts, 2 desal plants. I think we're on at least 4, maybe 5 long-term water supply plans, starting with the master water plan way back in the mid-'80s. I have learned so much from you, and again, I've considered you a mentor and friend for all those years. I actually have a bottle of wine that was made by my son up in Oregon Pinot, from the commission with a card from us. And we will be seeing you down the trail a ways, because I know we're going to intersect in many other ways as you go forward in the next phase of your life, Betty 3.0. In that regard, congratulations, and we're going to miss you, Ben.
So when we
I want to say
I think
something.
he has
Yes.
a few words.
yes.
And that is this. I am so lucky to sit in this room with people who love to look at charts and graphs. You know, it's a pretty geeky crowd, and that's why I like this, and the finance has been so much fun. You guys bring in such great work together, and we have such a good time steeping ourselves in it. I mean, these guys are heroes. Joshua, Kelly,
Yeah.
Rebecca.
Agreed.
You guys have put in the hardest time under the greatest pressure. And you're under it right now. It's not stopping. And I wish you success and luck. I'm right there with you.
Dr. Keller.
Mr. Chairman, one additional comment. When I first got on the Water Commission, or Board of Water Commissioners, as it's properly called, in about 1987 or 88, Councilmember White was on it at that time, along with J.J. Hollister, the late lamented J.J. Hollister, and a few other people. And during that drought, which we're now calling the last drought, although who knows how long that terminology will hold up, we actually had a sort of kangaroo court right here when this room was brand new, where people who had huge bills from excessive Tier 3 water usage could come and apply for relief from their large bills, which we, in many cases, did dispense. And Bendy and I were on that kangaroo court. I can't remember who else, but he actually knew who all these people were, too. So I found out who we were talking. One person that I think we did let off was the police chief at the time. At any rate, here's a little story.
And there was one fellow who was just saying, you know, he'd been away. Well, he'd been sent away as a child molester. And
You see it in government, you see it all. I have to say. Okay, Bendy. See you down the road, bud.
Stick around. We have some refreshments, and I think we'd like to celebrate.
Great. Meeting adjourned.